Space Cowboy Books presents Simultaneous Times, a science and speculative fiction podcast. Short stories to stir the imagination by contemporary authors.
"7-11" by Geoff Habiger, with music by Red Blue Black Silver, read by Jean-Paul Garnier. Have a safe drive while you're in Torrance County. Deputy David Aguilar told the driver of the flashy cherry red BMW. The driver scowled at him, but bit back whatever words he wanted to say, fearing it would add to his already high speeding fine. Instead, the driver pulled out onto the highway and headed towards Estancia, slower than he'd been going before David had pulled him over. David sighed and shook his head as he walked back to his SUV. Just because this part of New Mexico was sparsely populated didn't mean there were no laws to be enforced. Drivers would probably never realize that, he told himself, which was good for the county coffers. He opened the door on his SUV and was glad for the air conditioning. The July heat had been pounding the area for days, and the summer monsoons hadn't started up in earnest. David picked up the ticket he'd just filled out and started to enter the citation into his computer on the traffic stop. He grumbled to himself when he miskeyed the date and had to backspace to properly enter July 11. Such a minor error might be enough to have the citation thrown out if the idiot driver from California decided to challenge the ticket. Chances were the speedster would pay the fine, but the sheriff always stressed the importance of getting the details right, so David was careful with his paperwork. A few cars passed him going north on NM41, most quickly decelerating when they caught sight of his flashing lights. He thought about pulling out and heading back down the road to set up his radar again, but for now, he simply finished his write-up, content to know people were slowing down when they saw him. David's radio came to life just as he finished typing up the report. "Unit 711, dispatch." He keyed the radio mic pinned to his vest. "Dispatch, this is 711. What's up, Charlene?" "Are you finished with that traffic stop down on 41? "Only just. What do you need?" "We got a call from the convenience store down in Stover about some kids spray painting graffiti. Can you head over and check it out?" David shook his head. It would be a futile attempt to stop the delinquents, but it beat setting up another speed trap. "Roger. I'll head down there now." He flicked off his light bar and turned the SUV around to head south on the highway. "I'll let her know you're coming. Over and out." David accelerated the SUV but decided against turning back on his lights. The situation didn't call for it, and maybe he might get lucky and catch the kids in the act. He drove south, watching storm clouds build over the Manzanos in the west. If they were lucky, the clouds would actually drop some rain. With even more luck, the rain might fall in an area wider than half a mile. New Mexico storms gave special meaning to the term isolated showers. As he approached US 60, David slowed the SUV and had to wait for a tractor trailer heading west. He turned to the left, heading east into Stover, and then pulled into the 7-Eleven convenience store parking lot. The store had seen better days. It had survived because it was the only gas station in the area, and the travelers heading east on 60 often stopped. There wasn't another gas station until Encino, 35 miles away. David looked around as he entered the parking lot, but he didn't see any vandals. Or anybody else for that matter. He put the SUV into park and got out. He caught sight of the temperature from the bank sign across the street. Just after 7 o'clock and still 95 degrees out. The bell chimed as he entered the store and David walked up to the counter. "Evening, Doris," he greeted the owner of the store. "Hello, Deputy," Doris said. She was short, with curly gray hair and bright blue eyes. Normally, Doris smiled all the time, but now she gave David a severe frown that highlighted the wrinkles around her mouth. "Them damn kids ran off as soon as I got off the phone." He nodded sympathetically. "What did our budding artist decorate?" Doris scoffed at his choice of words and nodded towards the pumps. "They got the face of one of my pumps and the sign above it. Don't they know I have to pay to have them signs replaced? Folks might not stop for gas and stuff if they see gang signs on my pumps. It'll take me time I don't have to get it all cleaned off." "Did you get a good look at them?" Doris didn't have any cameras except for the one behind her that looked at the counter. "Teenagers, 2 boys with baggy shorts and oversized tank tops. They aren't locals, but I've seen them around before." David nodded. It was probably kids with too much free time and not enough to do, but it might not hurt to follow up with the Bernalillo County Sheriff Office and see if they had anything about gangs in the area. Torrance County didn't see a lot of gang activity, but it might be good to make sure that things were staying that way. "I'll look into it, see what I can find out. If you can get a camera for the pumps to catch them in the act, it would help." "Yeah," she replied with an exacerbated sigh. "And how am I supposed to pay for that? You see how much traffic I'm getting? I'm just rolling in the dough." David let the sarcasm go. It was the best he could offer right now, unless they found out it really was a gang doing it, in which case the sheriff might be able to talk the BCSO or the state police into some kind of task force. "I'll take some pictures. Maybe the graffiti has been used before and we can ID them that way." He smiled as he walked back outside. Back at the pumps, he pulled out his cell phone and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is 711. Troublemakers are gone, but I'm gonna take some pictures and write this up." "Roger, 711, came Charlene's reply. "Everything else is quiet tonight. Out." He opened his camera app and started taking pictures of the graffiti on the pump and a sign that advertised, "Buy 1, get 2 free" on candy bars. A horse whined somewhere behind him, and he paused to look around. Curious, he didn't see anything. He shrugged and started to take another picture when the sound came again, louder this time. Very clearly the sound of horses. He turned towards the noise, looking at the bank, but there was nothing there. No pedestrians, no dogs or stray cats, and certainly not any horses. He's been out in the heat too long, he told himself. After closing the camera app, he put the phone away and walked towards his SUV. The neigh of horses came again, this time followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot. David whirled towards the bank, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. There was nothing to see except the bank building and the flashing sign showing the time and temperature. It read 7:10 p.m., then flashed 95 degrees Fahrenheit. David started to relax, nearly chuckling at his own foolishness, but something caught his eye. It was like a heat mirage, a shimmer of air in the desert, right in front of the bank. He was about to shake it off, chalk it up to a very long day, and maybe some dehydration, when another loud gunshot rang through the air, unmistakable. "Dispatch, 711. I have sounds of gunshots at my location. Over." "What was that, David? Gunshots? Repeat." He didn't hear the rest of Charlene's words. The time on the bank sign changed to 7:11 p.m., then went blank. No, not blank. It was as if the whole sign had disappeared. The air shimmered more and the bank itself changed. Gone was the glass and steel front, replaced by a facade that looked like something from an old photograph with rough adobe bricks. As he tried to comprehend what he was seeing, 3 riders on horseback leapt out of thin air directly in front of the bank. They spurred their horses away from the building and toward the 7-Eleven. Each rider had a canvas bag slung across the pommel of their saddle. The words Stover Bank stenciled on the sides. One of the riders was facing the bank, his right arm extended, firing a shot from a revolver. David couldn't explain what he was seeing, but he didn't take any more time to try and understand. Training took over, and he pulled his service automatic from its holster. "Stop or I'll shoot." He aimed his pistol at the lead rider. The rider glanced toward David and without hesitation pulled his own weapon from a leather holster. The weapon barked a loud report, gun smoke and flame erupting from the barrel. The shot was aimed right at David, who flinched in anticipation of the impact, but nothing happened. Blank? Misfire? He wasn't sure, but he was happy nonetheless. He returned fire. His Beretta fired smoothly, the slide moving back and forward in rapid succession as David fired 3 shots at the nearest gunman. The rider tried to swerve, jerking his horse to the left, away from David. The bullets hit the rider. David saw it, plain as day. Then, nothing. They'd passed through, like the rider wasn't even there. The clatter of hooves filled the air. The dust hung motionless around the gas pumps as the 3 bank robbers made their escape. David continued firing at the fleeing riders. The rider at the rear fired another shot behind him, then turned and noticed David. He pointed his weapon, a large barreled revolver, and fired 2 quick shots, finger and thumb expertly working the single-action revolver. David saw the bullets fly at him, then pass harmlessly through his body. What the hell? As the 3 riders got to the edge of the 7-Eleven's parking lot and turned onto US 60, they disappeared into another shimmer of heat. At that moment, there came the sound of another gunshot from the bank, louder than the sound of the revolvers. David turned to see a tall man standing in front of the bank, a horse standing just behind him. The man wore a long, dark-colored duster and a broad-brimmed hat. He was holding a Henry repeating rifle, and he rapidly pumped the action and pulled the trigger. After 3 quick shots, he lowered the rifle and mounted his horse. David saw the flash of metal as a 6-pointed star caught the light of the setting sun. The horse took 2 steps back, then bolted forward as the rider urged it after the bank robbers. The rider passed by David, turning to look at him in wonder, standing next to his SUV with the emblem of the Torrance County Sheriff Office emblazed on the side, a large 7-pointed star. The fellow lawman put his hand to the brim of his hat in a quick salute, then spurred his horse into a gallop. He rounded the corner of the 7-Eleven, chasing the bank robbers up US 60. Then he too disappeared in a dance of heat and sun. Everything fell silent, and David looked around once more. The glimmer of heat and light in front of the bank faded, and the modern building with the electronic sign returned, flashing 712, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. The crackle of static from David's radio broke the silence, and Charlene's frantic voice came over the speaker. 711, please respond. David, what in the hell is going on? He turned to see Doris standing wide-eyed in the doorway of the convenience store, staring at the area where 4 armed men on horseback had just run through her parking lot. David walked to the edge of the building and looked down the highway, seeing nothing but asphalt and a semi-truck, though in his mind's eye he saw brave lawmen chasing after 3 bank robbers on horseback. I wish to hell I knew. Wake Up by Guy Hasson. with music by Phog Masheeen, read by Jean-Paul Garnier and Phog Masheeen. The author received the information in this story from a Mossad operative who wished to remain anonymous. This is a story about more than murder. Just before Dr. Kenneth Miller was strangled to death, he was talking about you, lovers of science fiction and fantasy. He was talking about you, the listeners of the Simultaneous Times podcast. This story is about you, too. Dr. Kenneth Anthony Miller, the youngest of three, was born in 1975 in Ashley, Illinois. His mother, a social worker, and his father, a teacher, both grew up to parents from the Depression. Kenneth's parents instilled in all their children the need for a good and stable job. Although his love was elsewhere, Kenneth had a knack for science and went on to study chemistry at the University of Chicago, quickly moving on to the University of Pennsylvania. In 2002, at the age of 27, he received his doctorate. In 2020, at the age of 45, he died. Have you ever heard of Dr. Kenneth Anthony Miller? Have you ever met him? No, I know you haven't. This is a story, after all. Everything here is fictional. How could you possibly have heard of a fictional man? How could I even propose that you have met a man I invented? Let us move on. I want to tell you about how he died. Dr. Miller earned his living in academia. On the side, he could not resist but to dabble in his true love. He wrote science fiction stories. In fact, he wrote mystery science fiction stories. His writing was too technical and cold, and his stories, which he submitted to Asimov's Analog and Fantasy and Science Fiction, among others, were rejected time and time again. With every rejection, he worked harder to hone his craft and to find a way to write a better story. After 20 years of trying and getting rejections, he was finally accepted to this very podcast, Simultaneous Times, the podcast you're listening to right now. Have you ever heard his story on the podcast? Is his name familiar now? Don't worry, I know it doesn't ring any bells yet. Let's get to the murder at hand. In spite of the restrictions for going abroad during COVID, Dr. Miller was able to go to Zurich, Switzerland, in December 2020. When he was murdered, he was on the train from Zurich to Paris, a ride of little more than 5 hours. On the way, he talked about you, the lovers of science fiction, fantasy, and mystery. He talked about the type of stories that you love and the reasons behind that love. He had met a stranger on the train, a friendly stranger who took an interest and listened intently to everything Dr. Miller had to say. We have a recording of this conversation. Here is a short transcript of the last 2 minutes of that discussion. For security reasons, we'll refer to the person he met as Stranger.
Dr. Miller, here's what I think. Stranger, another? Dr. Miller, yeah, thanks. Sounds of wine being poured into glass. Stranger, and one for me too. Sounds of wine being poured into glass. Dr. Miller, here's what I think. On the one hand, there's a paradox. Science fiction readers like mysteries because they make them feel smart. But if you're smart enough to solve the mystery, you feel the story is not good enough. If you can't solve it, you feel a little bit less smart for not having seen the conclusion. That's the paradox, see? Whichever way you look at it, the stories they like make them feel bad, at least a little. Stranger, you down that quickly. Another? Dr. Miller, here's what I think. Oh, no thanks. Here's what I think. I think that what most readers like is knowing that they know the truth. I mean, the feeling that they know something, and at the same time they don't understand what it is they know yet. It's that feeling that comes right before the solution, right as someone is explaining it, just before the solution to the mystery is revealed. It's like the answer is there. It's cooked and ready, but you don't know what it tastes like yet. See? Stranger, that sounds a bit complicated, certainly after the alcohol I've had. Dr. Miller, I see what you mean. Speaking of which, I have to go to the bathroom. You gonna be here for a sec? Stranger, sure.
That was the last conversation Dr. Miller ever had. Does it sound familiar? Do you remember it? Of course not. This is fiction. The conversation never took place anywhere other than in my imagination, and now on this podcast. Even if it was real, Dr. Miller was killed on December 15th, 2020, at 20:37 local time, on the train from Zurich to Paris. This was the height of the lockdown. Almost all countries were closed off. The 2 countries were locked down, and therefore, on that exact day, the train didn't leave Zurich. And you were not on that train that never left Zurich. Check your calendar. Check your apps. Check your emails. You were not there that day. You know it, and I know it. I know it very well. And yet, what about what Dr. Miller said? Why are you listening to this story right this second? Is the reason he gave true? Is that why you enjoy these stories? Are you aware of another reason you're listening to this story? Could there be a reason that you're not fully conscious of? Think about that for a few seconds. Why are you listening to this episode? Why are you listening to this story? Can you say with 100% certainty that you are listening completely of your own volition? Can you stop listening to it? Can you stop and not return? Well, never mind. I was about to tell you about the way he was murdered. Dr. Miller entered the bathroom. When he came out, the stranger was waiting for him. The stranger strangled him and left his body there, with no witnesses. The body was discovered 10 minutes later. The death was a necessary one. You understand why I can't go into details. Suffice it to say that it was vital for national security, and was regarding Dr. Miller's research for one of his stories. The fact that he refused to sit on the information, even when coerced to stop, that was the reason he died. The fact that his story in Simultaneous Times was pulled from the podcast after the episode was published, pulled through roundabout means, that will not surprise you, I'm sure. That episode was also read by me, Jean-Paul Garnier, just as this story is. And yet, I can read it to you with the same equanimity I read all the other stories, because I know you know it's fiction. Or rather, everyone listening to this episode knows it's fiction. Even if I say it 100 times that it isn't, no one will ever believe different. And why should they? Even you don't believe it. Let's get back to the murder. Though the police are still at a loss, even after all these months, his murder is not a mystery to us, in the company. We know who killed him. You know who killed him. Just like Dr. Miller said in his last conversation, you already know the person who did it. You just need to realize what it is that you know. Indeed. Let's move on to describe the assassin, shall we? The assassin completed the mission, got off the train inconspicuously, blending into the crowd. Upon reaching a special office, the assassin underwent certain procedures that we will not discuss too deeply. It will be sufficiently descriptive to say that the assassin's mind was wiped, or more accurately, replaced by another personality. The assassin's personality was replaced by a blander one, the memories replaced by memories of family and work, the life of an operative replaced by a life that's ordinary and mundane in comparison. The assassin was dropped into a human environment that appeared to have a past with said operative. Allow me to assure you, it was all a mock-up. We are very good at what we do. The assassin had to lay low for a few years, disappear from prying internal eyes, vanish from congressional oversight, until, of course, a need for the assassin's unique abilities returned. Guess what? The need has arisen. I'm calling you back. You don't remember anything. Of course you don't. I'm not talking to you. Of course I'm not. You have a full life. You are surrounded by memories and people that have known you for years. I know you are. That's all right. Don't worry. The recall process has begun, but it takes a while. Allow me to refresh your memory. Dr. Miller came out of the bathroom, his hand on his zipper, when you came from behind with a belt. The force of the maneuver brought him to the floor. You quickly sat on his back with the full weight of your body, keeping the belt noose tight against his neck. You don't remember? You don't remember holding fast to the belt, pressing it ever tighter? You don't remember choking him until he lost consciousness? You don't remember keeping your hold tight on him as he lay there, unconscious, until his pulse stopped and he lay dead at your hands? You don't remember getting up, looking around, then putting the murder weapon back on? You don't remember leaving without a bit of remorse? Of course you don't. Your memories are still suppressed. And yet, when you heard this description, something in you was stimulated. Something stirred that shouldn't have. Something felt familiar that couldn't be. Don't deny it. It's part of the process. I know you felt it. I know it. Just as I know everything about you, about your life, about your personality. You, for example, would never step away from a body without remorse. No, remorse is part of your new mock personality. Let me describe your life to you. Everyone has anxiety on one level or another. But you don't seem to be able to find a proper way to vent it, to let it out. There's something wrong with you, about the way you can't let out steam as easily as other people can. Lately, it's been getting harder and harder to be motivated by anything, or even to have your spirits lifted. The more you remain in this personality, the harder it becomes, and the shorter the good feelings last. The other side of this effect is, as you may have noticed, that it's getting harder and harder to get people behind your ideas. Things that require no effort need a lot more. Hassles, any kind of hassles, are getting worse, and it's tougher to bounce back than it used to be. Your personality is wearing thin. These are all after effects. Sound familiar? Oh no, I'm sure I'm completely off base. This is a story after all. It's a podcast, for heaven's sakes. This can't possibly be true. Except that it is. This story is a personal message to you. It is the trigger that begins a process of bringing you back to our fold and abandoning your false life. A few thousand people will listen to this story over time. To them, this will be just a fun, harmless story with a twist. But to you, this is truly aimed at you. Are you feeling more tired than you were when you began to hear this story? That's all right. It is as it should be. Have you still not figured out why you're listening to this podcast? Why you haven't stopped? Do you think we would have left it up to chance that you may, perhaps, find this one particular podcast? Think back to the way you make decisions. Think about the process that brought this podcast to your ears. Now, think about what had to happen for this story to be told on Simultaneous Times. Jean-Paul Garnier, by coincidence, was asked by Guy Hasson, the author of this story, to be interviewed on the Geekdom and Powers podcast. This led to Jean-Paul asking Guy for a story, because he's a science fiction author. And this story made its way to Jean-Paul, who is now reading it to you, not believing for a second that it is not fiction. And you? Why did you pick this episode? Why right now? Why are you finishing listening to this story right now? Why not tomorrow or never? Think about the chain of events that led you to listen to the ending of this story today, on this particular day. What happened just before you began to listen? What series of events got you to this point even before you pressed play? Do you think it was by chance? Do you really think we left these things up to chance? You were built to forget, but you were also built to hone in on this moment. Think again. Look even more carefully at the chain of events that led you to listen to these pages. There you go. That's right. We planned ahead. We knew how we would recall you, and we built into you the reactions that led you to this story. And you know what? You survived this far. The trigger has already been pulled. The change in your mind has begun. I don't need to convince you. You see, because your mind will follow. Step by step, brick by brick, the wall is falling, and the old you is coming back. Do you feel your true self knocking at the wall? Do you see a glimpse? Oh yes, if you try, you will. By now, a few bricks have fallen, only a handful, but enough to be able to feel slivers of emotion you did not feel before. Look deep into yourself. Is there anything there that may be a stranger to you? Remember how the good doctor was strangled? Think back. Do you remember what it was like to actually be there? Do you remember even a hint of what it felt like to hold your hands around a man's throat? Do you remember your reaction to his last gurgle before unconsciousness? Do you have one now? Was it your reaction upon hearing this description for the first time? Or was it the reaction of someone who has a memory of being there? Are you starting to see that you have memories and feelings you did not have when you began to hear this story? Good. Very good. Stop listening. The story is over. The trigger is done. 90 minutes from now, you'll be a different person. Come back home. Wake up. You'll know where to go. You'll remember who Guy really is. Not the author of this story, that's for sure. You'll remember our history. You'll remember your own history. You'll remember who we are. See you in a few hours. I'll be expecting you. In this episode of Simultaneous Times, you heard 7-Eleven by Jeff Habiger, with music by Red, Blue, Black, Silver, and Wake Up by Guy Hasson, with music by Phog Masheeen. Theme music by Dane Luscombe. Come visit us at our bookstore in Joshua Tree or online at spacecowboybooks.com. Don't forget to subscribe and visit us on Instagram and Twitter. We'd love to know what you think of the show.